Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Ben DuBose here, Paulo, Alves there. Thanks for checking out another new episode of The Lager Line. As always, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Karbach Brewing. We're recording this Monday night, June 24th, a little under 48 hours until the 2024 NBA Draft. Rockets are currently slated to pick at number 3 in the first round and number 44 in the second round, though it certainly sounds like the phone lines are very open for potential trades. We will talk about the draft before the end of tonight's show, but honestly, at this point, I kind of feel like we've said what needs to be said. We have several preview shows in our archives if you want to check those out. And at this point, we're pretty much just waiting to see what actually happens. Once it does, of course, we'll have extended reaction later in the week. So for now, I want to spin things forward and look ahead to the opening of free agency, which officially starts next Sunday night, June 30th. The day before that, Saturday the 29th, is when the majority of decisions on team options are due around the league. And we've heard from both Jonathan Fagan and Kelly Iko, great reporters here in Houston, that the Rockets plan to bring back all 3 of Jock Landale, Jeff Green, and Jayshawn Tate. That's their trio of team option guys for next season. So because you've got all those inflection points on the calendar and the draft coming up as well, you've got plenty of trade talks all around the league. And so what that adds up to is the next week or two being one of the most active transaction windows of the entire NBA calendar. Really, the only one that's even comparable is the week that leads up to the in-season trade deadline each February. So we've got a lot to discuss. There's actually a report that the Rockets are interested in potential free agent Paul George, although it appears to be unlikely. We will get to that. But I want to start our show with some more confirmed news, which is that according to Jonathan Fagan of the Houston Chronicle, the Rockets plan to save their non-taxpayer mid-level exception for future trades, as opposed to spending it in the first window of free agency. As a team operating above the salary cap this year, that non-taxpayer MLE is by far the biggest financial tool, well, excluding trades that is, that the Rockets will have to add to their roster, and theoretically it would allow them to offer a starting salary in the ballpark of about $13 million annually for up to 4 years. Now, as a reminder, this is a change under the NBA's new collective bargaining agreement. In contrast to previous CBA versions, this updated one allows teams to basically use the cap exceptions like trade exceptions. So basically, you can trade for contracts of players on other teams for up to their salary amount, and you can also use it to make a waiver claim. So for the Rockets, according to Jonathan, the thinking is basically this. Even if we exclude Landale, Tate, and Jeff Green, and we park those guys at the end of the bench, the Rockets already have a 9-man playing rotation just between the core 6 of young prospects and the 3 established veterans in Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks, and Steven Adams. And then if you stay at number 3 in the draft, or anywhere close to that, then that's a 10th guy that you'd like to find at least a little bit of immediate playing time for. So there's really not a ton of bang for your buck to use that MLE for if we're talking about adding a guy who might be 11th on your priority list. So considering that, the plan seems to be to save the MLE for when or if a consolidation trade happens down the line. Maybe it's later in the offseason, maybe it's during the season closer to the trade deadline, but the idea is that if the Rockets eventually end up trading 3 or 4 rotation players for one more proven commodity, maybe that star trade that we know they've pursued for years, then you would have the MLE available at that time to help you fill out those other rotation spots. You could absorb someone from another team via trade. Beyond that, I also want to make clear that Fagan did not write this part, but I also think there's a couple other considerations. So in our recent salary cap pod with Yossi Goslin, we talked about the importance of not aggressively spending the MLE for multiple years because you don't want to clog your salary books in 2025. You need at least the potential of having salary cap space in 2025. Keep in mind that's the year you'll have a team option on the giant Fred VanVleet deal because that could help you on the trade market. Well, the thing is, the longer you go without making a big trade, the more important that potential 2025 cap room becomes. So it kind of works hand in hand with saving the MLE because you can keep that flexibility. Conversely, if you do make a big trade, then that probably makes the potential cap room less important. So in that scenario, you can more easily justify spending the MLE. The other possibility that I would note, and again, this is me, not Jonathan, is that as you get closer to the trade deadline, there's probably going to be teams that are trying to dump salary for luxury tax purposes so you can potentially get a draft asset in exchange for taking on a contract that someone else needs to ditch. So you add all that up, and it looks like minimum deals and maybe the biannual exception, which allows you to spend about $5 million annually for up to 2 years, are probably going to be what the Rockets use or offer at the start of free agency. And so my guess is that's why some of the names that are linked to the Rockets, Kelly Eco recently reported some two-way wing players like Alec Burks, Taylor Horton-Tucker, and Gary Harris. Those are generally, while nice players, a tier below the true MLE names. And so I think what that means is that assuming no major deal, you're probably looking at names like that aren't very sexy, but I'm okay with it because I do see the logic behind it and I get the bigger picture. Paulo, what are your thoughts as far as that being the opening strategy heading into the new fiscal year?
Yeah, I think earlier on in the offseason, people talked about, or I think it was Kelly Eco that reported Malik Beasley, right? And I thought at the time that it made sense depending on how the draft went. But truth is, what we've talked about in relation to the draft also applies to free agency, which is we have 10 guys that need minutes right now. And that's even, and that's already, if you're having a 10-man rotation, the back end of that rotation is going to play 10 minutes a night. And usually you're not signing a guy to $13 million a year with the goal of playing him, that little time. So it's the entire roster congestion thing. While you could make the argument that you should use it to sign someone because it disappears at the end of the season every single season, there's definitely upside to not using it. And usually if you sign a guy, even if it at the time looks like a value deal and you don't play him enough, eventually that's not going to be a value deal, or it's harder and harder to make, to have that contract be an asset. So I definitely understand. I think, I don't know, considering the Rockets already have so many small flexible salaries that they could trade, I don't know how much it will contribute if they're looking for a consolidation move, because if it is a traded player exception, you can combine it with other salaries, you can aggregate it. So, and on that front, not really, but it could save you not having to move someone and you use the TPE instead if you're just looking to take on a salary or something of the sort, right? And instead of having to use Jeff Green as filler, who played the role last season, you instead use that TPE/MLE, and you are able to keep Jeff Green as well. So it's definitely nothing crazy. It's not. I know people are going to try to spin it as Stillman being cheap or something like that. It really has nothing to do with that. I don't.
Well, and if you wanted to spin it as Tillman being cheap, they could just not pick up the option for someone like Jock Landale or Jeff Green, who's going to be getting paid close to $10 million to not play. So I think that pushes back on that. They're picking up team options for guys in Tate, Landale, and Jeff, who at the moment aren't even in your rotation. You're going to be paying close to $30 million combined for those three frontcourt players to be like spots 10 through 12 on your bench. But because it gives them trade optionality on one-year deals, they're basically spending $30 million to have them as trade chips. So I think that pushes back on that already.
Yeah, and I think you can also take away from the decision or the upcoming decision to not use the MLE as kind of a meter on how they value Tate, Landale, and Jeff Green. I think obviously Landale, they value him for his contract at the very least, and he has some upside of eventually being able to play, right? But he has that upside. Obviously, Jason Tate has the upside of having bird rights on him, so if his contract ends, the Rockets have flexibility in what they can do with him next offseason. And Jeff Green, just as a vet, that they don't think that there's a vet out there on the market for comparable value that they can use the MLE on that's going to be better than Jeff Green. So I think you can take that away as well, because they could have just not picked up the Jeff Green's option or non-guarantee and just signed someone with the MLE instead. But no, they thought that Jeff Green was worth his salary and better than what the alternatives are out there on the market for what they were looking to get out of that roster spot. So I think all in all, it makes some sense, and I think worst case scenario, you'll see them get, you'll see the team that everybody complains that wastes second round picks potentially get 1 or 2 second round picks from a salary dump at the deadline.
Right.
And then hopefully when that happens, it will be as celebrated as it was maligned when they did the opposite last offseason.
God forbid we have another Ty Washington Usman Garuba deal. Yeah, the assets you get for taking on a contract into the MLE TPE, effectively, I think we can call it that, should be celebrated just as much as that one was panned. Anyway, amongst the names that have been listed to this point that I think are in the biannual exception or even minimum deal range, Gary Harris, Taylor Horton-Tucker, Alec Burks. Kelly reported that Eric Gordon was potentially interested in a reunion as well, although he did not say whether the Rockets had interest on their end. Jonathan mentioned that Aaron Holiday was a possibility to come back. However, if the Rockets end up drafting Reed Shepherd, that could make it less likely because that's 2 small guards. I think the moral of the story is that because so many of your established players are front court pieces, Landale, Tate, and Green on 1-year deals, anyone you sign to a short-term deal with a biannual or minimum is more likely to be in the wing or guard tier. So do you have any preferences in that range, or is it just, if they're that cheap, just take whoever's most willing to take a friendly deal?
Yeah, so definitely Gary Harris had, when he was with the Nuggets, had, I think, a couple of down years. But then when he moved on to Orlando, he's had a 38% three-point shooting season, 43% to 37%. I think he's definitely someone that's interesting. I don't think that he'll be as cheap as the biannual exception. Maybe he will, but I don't know. I find that tough too. He's making $13 million on the deal that was signed 2 years ago. So I think if they can get him on that deal, I think that's guaranteed to be an asset. But I think that's just too cheap for a player of this quality. He's obviously a good defender. If you were to get Alec Burks, I think most of the value would actually come from the fact that he's not playing for other teams against the Rockets, because he seems to be, at least with the Knicks, he seems to be one of those guys that always goes off against us. And then I would say, listen, I'm not, there's a new CBA. I'm not sure if this would work. Well, what if we spent it on Khalil Ware?
Oh, jeez.
I had to get it in there. I had to.
God.
I'm not going to talk barely any draft. I had to do it.
Well, we might, because there are some trade down scenarios. So save that for later on, and we can circle back at the end of the pod. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, I was happy enough with getting this one in this early on. So
yeah, opening 15 minutes, the obligatory Khalil Ware mention, and of course we'll get another one towards the back half of the pod. Already spoiled that. Anyway, before we get to the draft, because again, at this point, I think a lot of the draft outlook is sort of baked in, and we're just waiting to see what the Rockets actually do, be it picking at 3 or trading down a little bit. It doesn't sound like there's really any momentum for trading out entirely, or just not enough value for doing so in a draft that's considered subpar. But time will tell. Don't have to wait very long to find out. Draft, at least the first round, is Wednesday night, and the second round is Thursday afternoon. Anyway, most of this pod I want to spend talking about the free agency and trade window, which free agency officially opens on Sunday the 30th, although we know behind the scenes there's negotiations going on now. And of course, the trade window opened up basically as soon as the NBA Finals ended last week. And so those discussions are going on all around the league. And I really want to talk about this Paul George situation because there was some concrete reporting today, and I've done some digging myself as well. So in Sunday's mini podcast, which I did solo just to sort of give an update on where we are entering draft week and this transaction window, I mentioned that I found it very curious that the 76ers were pulling out of the Paul George talks, yet there was no new deal with the Clippers. And it suggested to me that there could be at least one mystery team that the opt-in and trade route like Chris Paul in 2017 was viable. We've heard some NBA insiders, most notably Brian Windhorst of ESPN, alluding to that possibility. And now on Monday, Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype dropped something of a bombshell that PG is definitely on Houston's radar, although he added that he considers it unlikely to actually happen. So after talking to some folks in the building at Toyota Center, I can say that's basically where I am as well. So I'm going to try and lay it out as far as what I think the criteria are for the Rockets and why it's unlikely to all line up in terms of the value being there for the Rockets, for Paul George, and the Clippers, since obviously the Rockets, as an above the salary cap team, would have to strike a trade, most likely an opt-in and trade, for a deal to work out. So I think in terms of why the Rockets are interested at a surface level, because there are some people, every time, Jackson Gatlin's been pushing this for 6 weeks on Locked On Rockets, this idea of an opt-in and trade for Paul George potentially being something for the Rockets to explore. And I'm told they have explored it. And there's a faction of the fan base that says, no, he's too old, that they just want to let the young guys develop. I actually don't agree with that. I think if you could get him, and we've discussed it in one of our previous episodes as well, if you could get him at a low enough price, Paul George is not James Harden from a year ago. He is not a ball-dominant guy. He can work off the ball. He's actually one of the best shooters of this generation. We're talking about someone over the last 8 years, he shoots right at 40% from three on high volume at like 8 attempts per game on average. He is one of the best shooters of this generation. He's got length. He can function off ball. And if you're worried about the Rockets and shooting, which we've heard a lot of that this offseason when it comes to the Reed Sheppard debate with the draft, we know the Rockets shoot a lot of threes, but last year they were below average in accuracy. And so a lot of folks want to upgrade that with Reed Sheppard. The thing is, and we've made this point before, it's not like Reed himself would move the needle all that much, at least at a team level, because in his initial role, he'd basically be replacing Aaron Holiday, who shot nearly 40% on threes last year at decent volume. That's really good. That's not where the problem was. And then long term, we've talked in the past about Reed potentially, if you draft him, being something of a Fred replacement as Fred ages. Maybe he gets too expensive once your young core gets into their second contracts. But Fred's a really good shooter too, so it's not like that really does a lot for you. The reason the Rockets have something of a shooting problem is structural. As things stand, of your 5 starters and your most important reserve, which I consider to be Amin Thompson, only 2 of them, Fred and Jabari Smith Jr., are guys that are clearly above average as shooters. And Jabari just a little bit. I think we project him to be with time, but he's only had 1 season shooting at an average to slightly above average level. The other 4, I would say Dillon's an average shooter, but there's issues with shot selection. Jalen, to this point, has been a slightly below average shooter for a shooting guard. Şengün is not a three-point threat, and Amin's not even close. So in terms of the shooting, that's where the Rockets have an issue. It's not just adding one more shooter, be it Reed Sheppard, or signing someone like a Malik Beasley.
That's a kick-ass player, by the way. You combine Amin Thompson with Reed Sheppard, dude.
That would actually be pretty amazing. But that is not why the Rockets have this issue. And it's not necessarily that it's going to be that way long term. Rafael Stone has said earlier this offseason that he expects the shooting to improve as the young guys get more mature and they take better shots. That tends to happen. Percentages improve as shot selection improves. And that happens as guys get more experience in the league. And hopefully, with Jalen in particular at shooting guard, that's something we start to see entering year 4. But Paul George, someone that is an established elite shooter at either shooting guard or small forward, if you were to upgrade Jalen Green or more reasonably Dillon Brooks, I don't think the Rockets would be looking at a 34-year-old Paul George to upgrade Jalen Green. I think there's too much of an age gap there when you look at the longer-term formula. Then yeah, that would change the shooting calculus. If you would go from Jalen or more likely Dillon to Paul George, then that would address your shooting problem in a big way by next season. And yet I don't think Paul George is so ball dominant that he would take away the touches for guys like Jalen, Şengün, and any of the other playmaking types that you want to develop and get more reps as the years progress. So in a basketball sense, he would absolutely fit. He would make you a better team next season. And I think if you add Paul George in place of Dillon Brooks, I think this is a playoff team, assuming relative health. So there's value in that. And if you could get him for, say, Dillon Brooks, 2 of your expiring contracts, someone in the Landale, Tate, Jeff Green tier, and maybe 1 first-round pick, I think you should and would do that in a heartbeat. The problem is that's not going to work asset-wise for the Clippers, because the scenario in which the Rockets could get Paul George is him opting into the final year of his existing deal at, I think, $48 million. And Paul George, all the reasons he would be attractive to the Rockets on a one-year deal without any long-term commitment, which of course mitigates the age risk to a degree, he would also be attractive to other teams around the league. And so the only way you could get him for as cheap as a package as basically like Dillon and one future first is if Paul George said Houston or bust. I don't think that's realistic. And then even if it was, I think the Clippers might just call his bluff in that scenario. More realistically, I think Paul George might be open to Houston. And I think the Rockets have done some digging on this behind the scenes. I think they put in the legwork. They do see the basketball merits, but he would be interested in some other destinations as well. And so that's where you get into the asset cost and whether Houston's bid could compete with others that are offered to the Clippers. And that's in the scenario where the Clippers don't give Paul George what he wants. Maybe ultimately the Clippers just cave and he ends up staying with Kawhi and James Harden and they run it back. I think that's in play as well. But in terms of the asset cost, that's where it gets really tricky because could the Rockets bid aggressively for Paul George? Yes, but that's where you get into the timeline considerations. A 34-year-old Paul George makes you better next season. I don't think he makes you a contender. So by the time you could actually truly contend for a championship, he'd be 35, 36 years old. Who knows if you'd be able to reach a second contract agreement with him. And then even if you could, he's probably going to be on the decline, at least to a small extent, by that point in time. I think Paul George would age gracefully given the profile of his game, but all guys, or at least the vast majority, do start to slip a little bit by the time you get into the mid to late 30s, which is what I think Paul will be at by the time the Rockets are ready to contend. So with that in mind, if the window is not open right away, why would you bid super aggressively with tons of assets, be it multiple first-round picks or members of your young core, perhaps both, that you might need later for a player that could help you when your window is actually open? The other part of it is that I think in an ideal world, the Rockets want to get more information about their young core to help them prioritize who to trade in that type of blockbuster scenario. Because right now, there's still a lot of mystery. Look, we saw last year there were times that both Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green looked like potentially star-level alphas, but it didn't happen at the same time. And, of course, with Jalen, it didn't happen nearly as frequently. Jalen had the 1 month. Alperen Sengun had the majority of the first half of the season, but neither one of them put together a full season at that alpha star level, and it wasn't at the same time. So I think there's still some questions there as far as those two guys and how they fit. You've got the extension calculations to weigh over the next year as well. I think in terms of positional overlap, you've got Jalen Green and Cam Whitmore on the wing. I don't know how realistic it is to keep both of those guys long-term. There's a little bit of overlap between Jabari Smith and Tari Eason. And so I think before the Rockets make a deal that dips into their young core in any way, they would like to get a little bit more information to help them prioritize who do we want to keep long-term and who are we more likely or more advantaged to use in a trade scenario. That's not to say the Rockets would never make a deal before having that information. I think, Donovan Mitchell is a good example, someone who's just 27 years old. If he was on the market, and at this point it looks like he's going back to Cleveland, but if he was on the market, he's young enough to where I think the Rockets, even though they don't have that information, would say, look, we'll make an educated guess because Donovan Mitchell, even if we don't know quite yet who's going to be the best of this core six, and even if we have to dip into our first-round asset stockpile, he's young enough to where he's still going to potentially be an all-NBA level player when our contending window actually opens. I don't think that's the case with Paul George, so I don't think the Rockets want to dip that heavily into their asset stockpile of future first-round picks, and I also don't think they want to force something involving their core six in terms of prioritizing the young prospects when in a perfect world they would want more information. So I think that's where things are with Paul George. The Rockets see the merits from a basketball standpoint, and if things lined up, would they do a deal for Paul George in a heartbeat? It's just when you consider that Paul George opting in on a one-year deal would make him very attractive to teams across the league, including contenders, the Rockets would have to bid a lot more aggressively than just Dillon's salary filler and one pick. And in that scenario, I just don't think it's worth it to the Rockets to invest super heavily in terms of future first-round picks or members of their young core for a guy who's 34 years old and probably won't be in his prime by the time the true title contention window actually opens. So I think that's where the Rockets are at with Paul George. It's interesting, on a basketball level, there's merits, but it's more of a theoretical exercise than a practical one. And I would agree that for those reasons, it's unlikely. Not impossible. You never know. And I do think that as long as there are some basketball merits, which there are, you can't completely foreclose the possibility. But when you look at the asset perspective, when you look at the business of it all, I think unlikely is a good characterization. And so it's not something I'm expecting to happen. Paulo, does that all make sense to you? Where do you come in? Because I know Paul George is one of your favorite guys in the league.
Yeah, it's rough exactly because of that. Because if you ask me about any player that's over 30, I'm probably going to say don't. Paul George, to me, he's like, I tweeted about this today. I think if I could bring one guy back on his rookie deal, back on his rookie age to this team, Paul George wouldn't be number one because you got to consider LeBron and Giannis, and all of that. But he'd be pretty freaking high up the list just because of his game, of his height, of his length, of his defense, of everything. He's a guy that you could. He's what you wish Jalen Green could become eventually. Probably not because he's never going to be as tall or as lengthy as him, but the same style. He's, for me, the perfect shooting guard, basically. That being said, I think there should be some space. So what I would say is, personally, I would not do it because, as you said, I think the asset cost would be too high to make a move like that right now while not knowing enough about the young guys that we currently have. But I think there is an argument to be made for the potential benefits of a trade for a win-now superstar that's older than 30 if the asset cost is not crippling enough that you would not be able to swing a superstar trade down the line if you needed to. So, and why is that? Because I think that there would be, while I'm confident that we'll make the playoffs next year, it's far from a guarantee. You can assume growth from the season before, but the West is a bloodbath, and I think by next season we'll get into this as the offseason, continues. I think we need to be a playoff team by next year. I think that injection of reality to a young core such as ours would benefit them greatly. I think they benefited greatly from the stringent culture with Ime Udoka, just like everybody, or at least on this podcast, projected before the season started. I think the next step is getting to the playoffs, seeing how the game works in the playoffs. I think this year's playoffs are a perfect encapsulation of how different the game is in the playoffs versus the regular season. Where, I think if you based it off the regular season, nobody would have guessed that the Mavs would have got to the finals. But the truth is, they did, and it was because they matched up well against a number of teams. And so, obviously, in the playoffs, everybody focuses on the micro of your game. If anything can be exploited, it will be exploited. I think that experience would be really good for the young guys. And perhaps it's not realistic, but I do think that something could snap for some of our guys once they got to the playoffs and they saw, this is what we're playing for. Because we have obviously a lot of high level prospects, and those usually go to good schools. But that doesn't mean that they got to experience, that type of environment or anything similar. Jalen Green didn't go to March Madness. He was obviously in the G League. I think Darison went with LSU, but they didn't go far. Jabari and Auburn obviously crashed out fairly early on. Trying to remember the rest of our guys. Cam Whitmore, Villanova didn't go far. And Thompson was obviously not in a college situation. And where am I saying? Shingun's probably lived through this as an 18-year-old playing on a professional basketball team. Right. But he's probably the only one. Yeah, he's probably the only one who's lived through that. And I think that can change the way you look at the sport for some of these guys. And I think it can be kind of a clash with reality because most of these guys have severely out-talented their opponents when the lights are brightest up until this point in their careers, and now they already got the slap in the face of coming into the NBA, not being the guy anymore, not being so much better than everybody else. In the playoffs, that takes a step up. And now I'd like to hope that Jalen Green, for example, would greatly benefit from it. Now, I struggle to see a world where Paul George comes in and it's not at the shooting guard position. I do think that if Paul George were to come in, Jalen probably heads to the bench. Obviously, Paul George can play the three, and he's are, he's well big enough to play the three as from a measurement standpoint. But I do think that Ime Udoka would probably rather play, either Tyrese on Ime or Dylan Brooks at the three and play Paul George at the two, if he's trying to win. Because I think that's where Paul George is the biggest mismatch. I mean, how do you defend a 6'8" guy as a shooting guard? That being said, there is merit for a trade for a guy that's over 30. But obviously, it cannot come at the cost that Paul George is going to cost. Paul George is still an insanely good player. And unless I think good parallel is, unless it is a James Harden out of the Sixers situation where the price is not dictated by the market, the price is dictated by, the guy only wanting to go to one team, or the asset being so debilitated that nobody else wants to take the risk, but the talent is obviously there. And unless it's a James Harden type deal, I don't think we should do it because it would stop us from being able to make a similar deal for a guy that fits our timeline better. And Paul George there's obviously the Paul George specific concerns. He's obviously not been the greatest playoff performer. He's obviously, his game, while I would project it to age gracefully on the defensive end, with his injury history, you have to wonder when he'll start to slow down and not be able to keep up with guys the way that he's done so his entire career. So yeah, I think that's basically where I'm at. I think as a general rule of thumb, I'm high enough on our current guys that I would rather just run it back for one more season unless a transcendent guy comes around, like a Ja Morant or something like that. Unless one of those guys becomes available, I would just run it back at one more year of a sample on all of these guys. And by next season, there's even a possibility that, I think at this point, 4 years for Jalen Green is enough of a sample size where you have to make a decision on him. And if the decision is positive, hey, it's not even a problem to have. It's the best situation possible. If it doesn't, well, you just opened up 34 to 36 minutes a night that you can now completely, overhaul your roster construction situation around. Obviously, and being a two guard, obviously you can slide Dylan to the two if need be. You could play Ken Whitmore there. You could bring in a guy at any of probably 4 positions with the minutes that Jalen not being there would eventually free up. But hopefully, I'm not saying that I want this to happen, not at all. And if you follow the podcast for long enough, you know about this. I'm a huge Jalen guy. But I think it just makes sense to run it one more year, have more information on everybody, and we've been saying this for 2 or 3 years now because the rumors keep swirling. But I think actions speak louder than word, and the Rockets have chosen to be patient this far, and I think they will continue to do so. But this time it's for real. It's one more year for at least the 2021 draft class guys. And if you are someone who's pressed or wants to press for something sooner, I guess you can think about it like this: hey, it's just one more year before it is decided that some dramatic change is going to happen as far as the expectations for the young guys.
Yeah, and I'll point out with Paul George specifically, I think whatever small chance there is, we'll know by this Saturday, which is the deadline date for most team options around the league, well, team and player options, a player option in this case for PG for the next fiscal year, 2024 to 2025, because I think everyone saw what happened with James Harden and the Sixers last year, 4.5 months of just pure hell on both sides when Harden opted in, but he opted in without having an immediate trade lined up. I don't think Paul George would do that. I think the template is what I mentioned earlier, Chris Paul in 2017, going from the Clippers to the Rockets. He would opt in if he has a deal lined up right now. And so be it the Rockets or most likely someone else, that's how it would happen. And then if he opts out, if he becomes a free agent, then of course the Rockets wouldn't be in play because he would be largely looking at teams with cap space. And even if the Rockets wanted to do a sign and trade, I don't think, or even if they were able to, I don't think they would want to, just because of the concerns with giving money into his late 30s at the time in which the Rockets' young core would be going into their second contracts. I think any Paul George interest would be something exploratory on an opt-in basis and then see where you're at in a year. And while that's possible, it's unlikely given the asset cost. To your point, I do think it's worth at least floating the template, because in a basketball sense, yeah, adding a guy in his 30s could work if the cost is, let's say, Dylan Brooks, who's a solid starter. There is some value to that. Solid starter on a reasonable contract. filler contracts who are good in the locker room, guys like Jeff Green, Jayshon Tate, Jock Landale, and maybe one future first-round pick, if that could get you a marquee player that's established even in his 30s, there's basketball merits in doing that. It's just a question of whether such a player is actually available, whether the market would be there for the asset equation to work for both sides. With Paul George, it's probably not, just because there'd be too much competition for PG on a one-year deal. The one guy I'm a little curious about, and there's been one report, I think Mark Stein linking the Rockets to him, Jimmy Butler in Miami. I think his market's a little worse than Paul George, simply because there's slightly more injury risk, there's more wear and tear. Also, he has a player option in 2025, which might scare off some teams, given that injury history. So if theoretically Butler was available for something closer to that Brooks expirings and maybe one pick, something without dipping super deep into your young core, would that interest you in any way?
Probably not, just because Jimmy Butler is more of a guy that has to have the ball in his hands.
Fair.
Right? And you could look at it positively, as he is a perimeter closer that we don't have. But at the same time, it's just that he's what I can pull up the stats, but I would believe that he's shot the tops 2 3-point attempts per game over the last few years. Okay, it's Miami, right? We know they don't shoot a lot, but he shot over his contract with Miami, which is 5 years now. He's averaging 2 3-point attempts per game, which just doesn't cut it for a team like ours. From a culture standpoint, obviously Jimmy Butler's great, but I think at 35 years old, obviously had an injury-riddled season. I mean, actually, he's had them for the entire time he's been in Miami. I actually didn't notice that. But yeah, I'm not in. I'd be a lot more in on Paul George. Yeah, I would be on Jimmy Butler.
Yeah, he's an interesting case. He hasn't been super injury prone. He's played about 60 games per season, but it's just constant little nicks. And to me, those are actually more concerning. I think, let's say a guy like Marcus Smart, we might touch on that in our closing segment where we talk about some of the trade possibilities at 3, whether they stay or move down a little bit. But I'm not that worried about Marcus Smart from a year ago in terms of, is he injury prone? He only played in 20 games. It's just a random hand injury. That's a freak accident that can happen to anybody, as opposed to if it's constant nicks, if it's what's happened with Jimmy in Miami, to where he's missing 25 games or at least 20 every single season, it feels like, and to some of the same body parts, then yeah, that is less randomness and more, is it his style of play or his body that is making him more prone to these? And so, yeah, that to me is much more alarming than a guy that just has a random, he jams his thumb and there's a fracture and he misses a few months. That's a freak accident. The stuff that's happened with Jimmy is a little more alarming. Combine that with a little more ball dominance, less shooting. And I agree, it's not nearly the fit that Paul George is. It's just someone that from an asset cost, that might be a little more attainable in terms of what the Rockets are willing to give, as opposed to the Paul George market, where I think, the basketball fit is there. It's just the asset standpoint doesn't make sense for the Rockets to give what I think the Clippers would be in position to command, given the interest that Paul would have around the league. Anyway, let's close the book on that and turn our attention to the draft. This will be our final pre-draft pod. So I want to get your final thoughts, Paulo, on pick 3. I'll be quick because I've done a couple of pods, solo ones, mini pods, but pods nonetheless, in recent days. And what I keep going back to is the pod we did with Nathan Grubel a couple of weeks ago, Draft Deeper on Twitter, where I think you're seeing more and more of the mocks when it comes to Houston staying at 3, coalescing around Reed Shepherd. He seems to be the consensus. Kelly Eco is the one guy reporting that Donovan Clingan is still in play as well. But Reed is the one guy who, it's been confirmed, did go to Houston for a workout. I believe it was last Friday, and the Rockets met with him early in the process as well. So there is some level of interest there. There's more utility to his fit in terms of the shooting can fit in a number of roster constructs. But what Nathan said in our pod with him was that the question of whether you invest pick 3 in Reed Shepherd comes down to whether you are going to give him the runway to develop the other aspects of his game, i.e. the playmaking, the facilitating, the skills as a point guard, the defense. Because if you just want him to be a shooter who comes around screens and spaces the floor, you can get that through other means. You can trade down a little bit. You can sign someone like a Malik Beasley with your mid-level exception if that's purely your priority. So it comes down to this question of, is he worth pick 3? how does he fit in the long-term puzzle? And I think a lot of the interest in Reed is just based on how he fits as a shooter for a team that's been largely devoid of shooting the last couple of years. And I think, and we've done a good job, I feel like, in our archives of exploring this, the question for whether you should draft him that high comes down to not just the short-term fit, but more importantly, long-term, where does he fit in the puzzle? And perhaps he gives you something of a hedge for Jalen Green as well. I mentioned, Jalen Green and Cam Whitmore having some overlap. Perhaps Reed plays into that dynamic as well. But I think these are the conversations the Rockets are going to have internally. And when I pointed this out on Sunday's mini podcast, someone clipped about 45 seconds of it, and I went somewhat viral on Twitter with some of the folks responding, including Cooper Klein, a draft expert we've had on the pod before, saying, well, that's always a consideration. This idea that it's not just about what the player is as a prospect, but the runway you're able to give them. That's true. However, what's different, and I thought it was implied, but I want to restate it here, is that the Rockets are in a very unique spot as a team picking high in the draft. That is not bad. It's been a factor in previous years, but when you're 20-62, you can give your high draft picks, Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, a ton of runway. Because what else are you going to do? Your team is awful, so you just give them the longest leash possible and you hope they learn from their experiences. This year is different in that the Rockets have an established 9-man rotation. They are already a competent team, so it's not as easy to give Reed the runway to develop in the other aspects of his game. So to me, that's the consideration for the Rockets right now, with a core 6 already in place, with 3 veterans who definitely want to play between Fred, Dylan, and Steven Adams. Do the Rockets have the ability to fully develop and unlock Reed as part of their long-term puzzle? And if they don't, then maybe that's the scenario where it makes more sense to trade down a few spots and draft someone like a Devin Carter or a Dalton Connect that has a relatively high floor, but a lower ceiling. And so if they have a lower ceiling, then it's not as important to have this plan to develop them over the next 2 or 3 years, because you're looking at them, you're not prioritizing them anywhere near as heavily in the long-term puzzle as you would be if you stay at 3 and draft a guy like Reed Sheppard. So as we sort of close the book on the pre-draft portion of the offseason and the Rockets go into, the final 48 hours of actually needing to make a decision, where do you come in on that angle, Paulo, as far as at this point, it's not just about whether Reed is the best prospect at 3, but deciding whether actually picking at 3 is the right move, or whether the runway just isn't there and you want to move down or out in the draft. Because at this point, the sense I get from talking to the Rockets is that that's where they're at. It's less about deciding between Reed and the other prospects. I think, as we've said for weeks, for months really, that if it's close, that I think the extra utility from Reed and his shooting, his ability to fit in more roster constructs, would sort of be a tiebreaker over guys like Donovan Clingan or Stephon Castle. So I really think if they're at 3, Reed is the most likely pick, with that as a big reason. I just think it comes down to sort of just organizational philosophy. Do they want to invest that heavily in another young guy and developing him, or do they want to trade back or trade out to sort of build up the future war chest, maybe get a player that can help you from a role player standpoint, but isn't as important to develop the high-end elements of their game? Just where do you come in on those factors, Paulo, balancing, the upside of Reed Sheppard versus the runway that you would need to develop him?
Yeah, I think that people are allergic to the term fit, and it's regurgitated so often that you always draft the BPA and you never draft for fit, which is dumb. You always do that if you have a clean slate with your team and you're starting off a rebuild. That's when you do that. Or if the BPA is a tier above the other guys that you're considering, which is not the case in this draft. It's obviously, you can't assume that a player X coming out of the draft is going to develop to the fullest of his potential regardless of situation, because that's just not how it happens. And if that's not how it happens, then the calculus is, what the player's potential is, X, what you can get out of him with your current situation. Because perhaps with a guy like LeBron James, you could just throw him anywhere and he would develop. But guys that are less talented are situational, and they'll have success in certain teams and won't have success in other teams. And so you do have to take that into consideration. And as people hate to hear it, yes, you do have not to draft for fit, but to take fit into consideration in the sense that not the fit for the first year, but as we've talked about on this pod time and time again, you have to have somewhat of a path that the prospect can, travel in the quest to eventually being, part of the main rotation. There needs to be a path, a kind of lower resistance where the path is not clearly set up, but if he's good enough and if he reaches certain milestones, he'll be better than the next player on the team right now, and so you'll be able to replace them there. Or you'll have a kind of like a chink in the armor where of your rotation, where there's a guy that's not quite good enough, and it's possible that within the first couple of years, the guy you're going to draft is going to be better, and he'll slot into that part of the rotation. For the Rockets with Reed Shepard, I think Fred VanVleet's clearly that guy. Or if Jalen Green doesn't pan out, or there's multiple ways in which eventually Reed Shepard can come in and do it. And I don't think that Reed Shepard's that far away from being a good player, or I don't think he has the bust potential to, if the path isn't perfect, he's not going to pan out. A guy that shoots that well is going to be valuable at some point, unless he's a clear just no-go on defense, right? So I think he'll be good regardless, or he's a safer prospect than most, which means the Rockets can be more flexible in the way they approach bringing him along. And yes, you may not get the 95th percentile of the outcomes that he can be because you didn't give him starter level minutes from day one. Perhaps he can't become, I don't even think he has this level of potential, but he can't become Steph Curry-esque or let's throw a WNBA comparison. He can't be Caitlin Clark, right? And I think they have somewhat similar games. It's actually not. Am I wrong? I mean, the vision on the court.
I can see that. Yeah.
The deep threes. I mean, there's something there. Maybe he's not that.
Reed Shepard is Caitlin Clark. That is a comp you can only get here.
Right, but maybe if you get a lower version of it, but still a very useful player. Still get a Fred VanVleet maybe, right, out of Reed Shepard. And I mean, obviously Fred VanVleet within the scope of the NBA and Caitlin Clark within the scope of the WNBA, right? So I think he's a fairly safe pick, which is I think if we were advocating for taking, I don't know, Castle or one of the Ignite guys, or even Dillingham, I think it would be tougher to make the argument. But I think Reed Shepard's going to be good regardless, unless something drastic happens, like the defense just doesn't hold up. So as far as what's going to happen in 2 days, I'm honestly kind of open to all possibilities. I would probably rather take him, because I do like him, but you could convince me that trading him for a couple of high-value future first-round picks, or trading the pick for a couple of high-value future first-round picks from the Thunder. I don't even know who's drafted Thunder own anymore because it's so convoluted with all the trades that have happened. Probably the Clippers, right? They still have a couple of picks from the Clippers. So, hey, if the Thunder want to give us... No, probably the Clippers are going to be good now. I don't know, but if we could get a couple of, let's for comparison's sake, let's call it 2 Suns picks from the Nets. Obviously not going to be from the Nets, but equivalent value picks. I could be convinced that's a good move for the long-term future, especially if they are in the 2025 or 2026 draft because of how stacked they are, or if they are further down the line in 2029, 2030. And then I could also be convinced of a deal where you trade back, and I guess I'll throw in the Khalil Ware shout now. If you trade back with the Grizzlies, I'm not quite, I used to love Marcus Smart, but now with our questionable shooting, I don't love him as much, especially with the Dylan Brooks already here. And the fact that if you do make the Marcus Smart trade, you can't send Dylan Brooks back because, you could in theory.
Right. But you'd have to find a third team. You have to find a third team.
Exactly.
But still, he's a former Defensive Player of the Year who's basically the captain of Ime's Boston team. There's a ton of trust there. He's a decent contract no matter what at about $20 million a year for his production. Dude, if you could get Marcus Smart for a couple of your expirings and Khalil Ware, tell me you're not turning that down.
The thing is, he played 20 games this season, and that's scary because
That's a freak injury. That's what I was telling you. That I don't buy that too much. I think it depends on the nature of the injuries. Yeah, like if it's just a freak thing, like, he jams his thumb going after a loose ball, that to me is just random. I mean, there's some injury risk, don't get me wrong, and he's now 30 years old, so it's not nothing, but I wouldn't worry too much about the 20 factor. You could worry a little bit. Now, his production was down, but I think small sample on a new team, that's probably what's going on there.
Listen, I used to love Marcus Smart as a player. I still do think that he would have value, as tremendous value. Here, I would have to see what happens with the rest of the rotation in order to bring him in. Are we bringing him in to... Is it a straight swap with Dylan Brooks? In that case, I could be convinced. But...
But if he becomes like your 10th man and then you'd have another top 10 pick on top of that, then yeah, it gets really crowded. And that's where it goes back to what we were saying in the Paul George discussions. And, it's even tougher when you're trying to build a winning team, but it's not just about, how a deal looks in a vacuum. It's about the entire puzzle. And in some scenarios, it just doesn't fit. Or, to go back to the beginning of the pod, spending or not spending the mid-level exception. Look, you've already got a deep rotation as is. If you're bringing in Marcus Smart to be your 10th man, that is the juice worth the squeeze. That's sort of the conversation you have to have.
Yeah, and I think, listen, as I said, I could be convinced of a trade like that, depending
especially if there's Khalil Ware.
Especially if Khalil Ware is involved, obviously. I could be convinced about Cody Williams as well. He's starting to become one of my favorites. I could not be convinced of Dalton. I connect.
What about the one scenario I've wondered about? What if, because this comparison's been thrown out a lot, apparently he's dominated the workout circuit. What if Ime is convinced that Devin Carter, the guard out of Providence, is the Marcus Smart of the next generation? That's the one that I've sort of kept in the back of my mind because he does fit the Marcus Smart archetype.
But in that case, what would be if you're not getting Marcus Smart? You're getting Marcus Smart.
What are you getting to? Yeah, maybe a future first. I don't know. Fair point.
Yeah, if it is a good future first, listen, I'm a big proponent of getting more firsts in the next 2 drafts. If not those, then the furthest way the better. But I could be convinced of a deal like that as well. As I said, I'm not sold on the top of this draft class whatsoever beyond Alex Sarr, and sadly he's going to fall to 2, but not to 3. So I really like Reed Shepard. I can see the projectability of his role as an eventual threat and with replacement. And before people tell me again that that's Amen Thompson, you can do both. Amen can, those two fit together like a glove. And obviously Amen is never going to replace Fred VanVleet in the type of game that Fred VanVleet plays because it's so pull-up heavy. Even the biggest Amen Thompson proponents will never say that he's going to be as wing of a shooter as Fred VanVleet is. So you could still... Fit is not just position for position. You can run the playbook that you run with Fred VanVleet, with Reed Shepard in due time, and you can run with Amen Thompson the more downhill dribble handoff versions of it that you have Jalen Green run with Alperen Sengun right now. It's not a one or the other. You can have multiple, nuances to the way you play. So I like the Reed Shepard option. I like the trade down and Khalil Ware option. I like the trade down, and I mean Devin Carter option, definitely intriguing as well. I like the Marcus Smart option. I think it's just I haven't fallen in love with anybody in this draft, so I think that you could make the argument for any of these, and they would all be valid. If it were up to me, considering those 3 options, that the trade out, trade down, stay out, it would be a 35, 32 and a half in favor of staying at 3. But as I said, it's a 2.5% cap between the two, so it's not obviously crumb. Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say before we wrap up this pod, if you like the core 6, which I think you should if you're a Rockets fan, please have some trust in the front office that brought them here in the first place. There was an article by Kevin Pelton of ESPN, their analytics guy, that said that since 2019, the Rockets are by far leading the NBA in outkicking their coverage in terms of projection relative to draft slot. And of course, that speaks to getting guys like Alperen Sengun at 16, Tari Eason at 17, Cam Whitmore at 20 that have far outperformed the statistical models. for those picks to this point in their careers. So if you like what Rafael Stone and Eli Whitus have done in terms of this current Houston front office, and you should, I think we both agree, and I hope most of our listeners agree, they've done a great job over the 4 seasons of this rebuild, while entering the 4th season of it. I think if you trust them, or is it 4 seasons or 5? Yeah, we're going into the 5th, because you had the 3 seasons of bottoming out, and then you just had the 1 year with Ime Udoka where you got back to relevance. But the point is they've done a great job, and if you trust them to this point, then in a draft where I don't think there's a clear-cut decision on what's the best path, then have some trust in those guys. Not saying that you need to give them, an unlimited leash, but if it's within reason, then give them the benefit of the doubt. I think they've earned it. And so with that, that'll bring our pre-draft potting to a close. We'll circle back later in the week when we see who the Rockets actually draft, what move they actually make Wednesday night, because one way or another, there will be a move. Either they draft at 3 or they trade the pick. If they trade the pick, then of course we'll react to trading the pick and whatever they get. And then maybe we'll get even more intel about what they're going to do once the team option decisions. Sounds like those have already been made, but there will be some others around the league that get made by Saturday's deadline. And then we'll see if the Rockets sign anyone once the free agency negotiations can officially begin on Sunday night. Anyway, for now, on this Monday, June 24th, this is where we will wrap up. And if you want more content before our next show later in the week, the best place to get it, as always, is on Twitter/X, where I'm on there at Ben DuBose, Paulo's on there at Paulo Alves NBA, and the show, The Logger Line, is on there at The Logger Line, where if you go to the link tree in the Twitter/X bio, you can find links to our friends, partners, and sponsors. Obviously, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Wire, but also our individual distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify. Subscribe, leave a 5-star review if you have not already. You get the benefit of episodes right when they come out, and we get the benefit, hopefully with your happy review, of looking good to those friends, partners, and sponsors, and keeping this program running as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with those plugs complete, we will adjourn. For Paulo Alves, I'm Ben DuBose. Look forward to talking later in the week once the draft is over. Happy draft day.